Whether you've served, built, raised a family, or simply held the line through life's toughest moments, this one's for you. Tonight, we take you inside a debate that wasn't just political, it was personal. A story of two women, one stage, and a room full of Americans watching for something real. What unfolded wasn't a performance, it was a revelation. There was a hush before it all began, not silence, but a respectful stillness, like the kind that settles over a field before a storm rolls in. Inside the American Civic Forum, a room built on the bones of Philadelphia's revolutionary past, something heavier than history hung in the air. It was expectation and weariness. The kind only men who've seen too many promises broken, too many headlines twist the truth, could truly feel. The stage was simple, two podiums, one American flag. No theatrics, no flashy graphics, just truth, if it could survive the next 90 minutes. The audience had filed in early, men with lined faces and folded arms, some still in Union jackets, some carrying folded veteran caps on their knees. These were men who had served, built, taught, and rebuilt. Men who remembered when politicians spoke plainly and stood firmly. They weren't here to be impressed. They were here to see who deserved their trust. Then came the first entrance. Karoline Leavitt walked out with the precision of someone raised on order. No eye rolls, no fanfare, just a sharp stack of documents in her hand and that unmistakable steel in her posture. The crowd didn't cheer, but a few nodded. They recognized that look. It was the look of a soldier walking into fire with her facts loaded and her emotions locked down. Moments later, Jasmine Crockett emerged, vibrant, energized, commanding the spotlight like a preacher at a revival. Her smile was wide, her stance proud. She raised her hands slightly to the audience, inviting engagement. Some clapped, others didn't move. The contrast was stark, and it wasn't lost on the room. The moderator stepped forward, gray-hailed and somber. "Tonight," he said, "we return to the tradition of direct debate. You speak to the people, and the people will decide." The lights dimmed. The first timer lit up, the cameras rolled, and somewhere in that crowd of quiet, discerning men someone muttered exactly what the rest were thinking. Let's see who really knows what they're talking about. The first question came sharp and simple. Tariffs, manufacturing, inflation, are they saving the American worker or strangling him? The moderator's voice barely faded before Karoline Leavitt leaned into the mic, her hands still resting calmly on the podium. No preamble, no theatrics, just clarity. When President Trump reinstated steel tariffs in 2018, they told us it would cost jobs. It didn't. In Pennsylvania alone, steel manufacturing rose 12% in 2 years. That's not rhetoric, that's the U.S. Commerce Department. She paused, letting the data breathe. You want to talk about what's killing the American worker? Look at policies that ship jobs overseas and call it progress. There were no cheers, just stillness. The kind of stillness that happens when a room full of working men hears numbers that match their memory. Then came Jasmine Crockett, fiery as ever, gripping her notes like a torch. "You can cherry-pick your stats, Karoline, but my district in Texas has seen prices skyrocket. Eggs, rent, gas. Your tariffs didn't lift us up, they buried us. And don't forget the farmers who lost their export markets in the process. That's not recovery, that's political theater dressed as economic policy." The crowd shifted. Some nodded, others frowned, but everyone listened. Crockett stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "I've walked through neighborhoods where men who used to build things now stand in food pantry lines. Your administration's idea of strength is punishing them harder and calling it character." Leavitt's response was like cold steel. "And your idea of help is government checks and dependency? I'm not saying the economy's perfect, but don't pretend those problems started with us, or that you've solved them. We believe in rebuilding, not replacing, grit with grievance." The debate was no longer about policy papers, it was about the soul of the American worker, and what that meant in 2025. Jasmine fired back, her voice rising. "What about the single mother in Dallas who lost her job when the factory moved because of a trade war? Is she just a footnote in your GDP chart?" Leavitt didn't flinch. She deserves better. but telling her tariffs hurt her more than outsourcing did? That's not compassion, that's confusion. A murmur moved through the audience. You could feel it, the tug of war between reason and rage, between spreadsheets and lived experience. For every man in that room who had studied economic reports, there was another who had felt inflation with every checkout trip, every heating bill. That's what made this question hit harder than the rest. Because this wasn't about left or right anymore, it was about whether someone, anyone, could explain why the men who built this country kept getting left behind. And in that moment, watching two women clash beneath the American flag, it wasn't charisma that counted. It was who sounded like they actually understood the fight. It was bound to happen. When the facts weren't enough, the first personal jab arrived, subtle but sharp. Jasmine Crockett tilted her head, offered a practiced smile, and let the audience hear what she'd been holding back. "Karoline," she said, "I admire your confidence, really, especially for someone who was still in high school last time this country saw a balanced budget." A ripple of laughter stirred in one corner of the room, but most faces stayed flat. Some crossed their arms. Leavitt didn't move. She didn't blink. She let the silence stretch just long enough for Crockett to think she'd landed the punch. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice steady as polished steel. "Age doesn't fix broken math, Congresswoman." The crowd reacted, not with noise, but with a low murmur of appreciation. One man in a Union jacket let out a dry chuckle. Another nudged his son beside him and whispered, "That's how you answer a dig?" Leavitt continued, eyes locked forward. "You can question my age, but you can't question the numbers. You talk about balanced budgets, but let's talk about the trillion-dollar proposals your caucus rolls out like confetti, with no plan to pay for them. That's not leadership. That's fantasy finance." Crockett's smile tightened. "Maybe you'd understand better if you spent less time with spreadsheets and more time on the streets," she said, her voice rising again. "Real people don't live on graphs, Karoline." Leavitt didn't blink. "I was raised by real people. In a town where the mill shut down and we still showed up, I've lived what you claim to fight for." It was subtle, but in the tone, in the posture, in the control, it showed. Leavitt wasn't here to spar, she was here to endure. Crockett tried again, this time with bite. "You've been rehearsing for this your whole life, haven't you? Perfect press secretary, scripted, polished, and out of touch." Leavitt raised her eyebrows just slightly. "You keep saying I'm rehearsed. I keep bringing facts. What does that tell the audience about you?" That one landed. It didn't erupt in applause, but in nods, in the quiet exhale of men who've been in too many rooms where the loudest person was also the least prepared. That's when it became clear. This wasn't just a battle of ideas, it was a test of composure. And for the first time, the crack showed. Not in Leavitt, but in Crockett. She was swinging hard. But Karoline was standing firm, and the men in the room, they weren't cheering, they were judging. And they'd seen this dynamic before. A calm worker holding his line, while someone else made it personal. The air shifted, not with noise, but with anticipation, like a storm tightening in the silence before the lightning strikes. Karoline Leavitt's fingers moved methodically across the documents on her podium. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't responding to a personal jab. She was reaching for something. And everyone in the room could feel it. A veteran in the front row adjusted his cap. A young man with folded arms leaned forward, sensing something was coming. Even Jasmine Crockett paused, just briefly, as Karoline held up a small iPad and spoke. "I wasn't going to bring this out," she said calmly, her tone deceptively soft. "But since we're talking about who stands with the people, I'd like to remind the room of what was said when there weren't cameras rolling in Philadelphia. Just a microphone and a moment of truth." She tapped the screen. A voice filled the chamber. Jasmine Crockett's voice. Clear, unmistakable. "I don't care who funds me, as long as they're anti-Trump. I'll take the check." The room didn't explode. It sank. Like a punch to the chest, the sound of her own words reverberated off the wooden beams and historic walls. Crockett's face drained. Her jaw parted, then clenched. "That's taken out of context," she snapped, voice already climbing. That clip's from an interview 2 years ago. They edited it." Karoline's eyes didn't leave her. "It's publicly archived, aired in full on MSNBC. I didn't edit anything, but if you feel misrepresented, you're welcome to clarify it now, in front of everyone." It was surgical, clean, cold. The audience, largely made of men who'd seen their fair share of deception in business, politics, and war, knew the difference between a hit job and a tactical strike. And this was the latter. Crockett's fists gripped the edge of the podium. Her voice cracked with heat. "You're trying to twist this like I sold out. I was talking about the fight, about the resistance." Leavitt didn't raise her voice. "And in that fight you took $50,000, 0 cents in donations from an anti-Trump lobbying group you once called dirty capitalists." The moderator tried to interject. Too late. Crockett slammed her hand down. "Don't you dare try to smear me in front of this crowd like I'm some kind of fraud. I fight for real people." Leavitt cut in. "Then why won't you answer what you meant? You said you'd take funding from anyone, so is there a price tag on principle now?" The room erupted, not in chaos but in pointed, divided reaction. One man in the back muttered, "That's not leadership." A Union veteran near the front shook his head. Others stayed quiet. But their posture said everything. They were listening to Leavitt now, not reacting to Crockett. Jasmine tried to rally. "This is the oldest trick in the book. Find one sentence and turn it into a scandal. But it won't work." Leavitt leaned in, unblinking. "It's not one sentence. It's one standard. Either you're principled or you're for sale. You decided which. I just pressed play." The crowd let out a low, collective exhale. No cheering, just consequence. Crockett tried again, this time pleading to the room. "Do any of you really believe I sold out? That I don't care about the people just because of one damn quote?" And then a voice from the audience, deep, calm, unmistakably male, answered back, "That's the problem, Congresswoman. It's not just a quote. It's who you were when you didn't think we were listening." Silence. Karoline didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Jasmine turned to the moderator. "This is a hit job. This is not a debate. It's an ambush." But the room had already decided. The one yelling was losing. Crockett stood there, breathing hard, fury and desperation warring in her eyes. But the more she spoke, the more she sank. And behind her, Karoline Leavitt remained motionless, like the eye of a storm watching the winds tear themselves apart. And somewhere in the crowd, a father whispered to his grown son, "That's how you lead. You stay calm. You bring the truth. You let them fall apart." It wasn't just the words that unraveled Jasmine Crockett. It was the silence that followed them. She stood rigid behind her podium, blinking fast, fists still clenched around the edges like she could anchor herself to something solid. But there was nothing solid left. Her voice, once loud and fiery, had begun to tremble, not with conviction, but with the sound of someone losing control in front of millions. "You want to paint me as a sellout?" she snapped, stabbing a finger through the air. "Like I don't know what it's like to struggle? I grew up poor. I worked for everything I have. I've been out there marching, protesting, organizing, while you were memorizing talking points." But it didn't land. It didn't soar. The fire was there, yes, but so was the desperation. Karoline didn't interrupt. She didn't smirk. She didn't even shift her weight. She simply looked forward. Calm, collected, unmoved. That posture alone said more than 100 retorts. It said, "I've already won. I don't need to raise my voice to prove it." And that infuriated Jasmine even more. "You think reading a few reports makes you a warrior for the people?" Crockett barked, eyes flashing. "You haven't seen what I've seen. You haven't walked my streets," Leavitt finally responded. "But not with fire. With frost. I don't have to yell to know what I'm talking about," she said, her voice low, crisp. "And I certainly don't have to sell my voice to anyone willing to write a check." Boom. No applause. Just wait, like a dropped hammer in a quiet shop. Jasmine gripped the mic now, white-knuckled. "You know what? You're arrogant. You think being quiet makes you right, but you're just a puppet, a polished mouthpiece, for a man who's been wrecking this country since day one." Karoline's reply was surgical. "You've called me a puppet 3 times, she said, glancing at her notes. "You've yet to answer any of the economic numbers I gave. You've raised your voice. I've raised the standard. That's the difference." The audience murmured. Low, approving, firm. Jasmine snapped. "You're 27. 27, what do you know about sacrifice, about putting yourself on the line for people who have nothing?" Leavitt tilted her head slowly. "Apparently, I know enough not to melt down under pressure." That line hit hard. Not just for Crockett, but for every man watching who'd ever had to swallow pride in a meeting, keep their cool while being insulted, and stay professional when someone else cracked. They recognized what they were seeing now, a leader versus a loose cannon. Crockett began to shout. Not debate, shout. "You're a fraud, Karoline. You don't care about workers, you care about optics. You don't fight, you hide behind data like it makes you real." But it wasn't working anymore. Someone in the crowd shouted back, "Then show us your data." Others started nodding. The room was turning, slowly, deliberately, but definitely turning. The moderator tried to step in, voice tense. "Congresswoman Crockett, let's focus on the next question." But she ignored him, steamrolling forward. "No, I'm not going to sit here and let this little girl talk down to me like she's some kind of saint while she props up a billionaire's agenda." Karoline raised a single hand. Not high, just enough, then spoke directly into the mic. "This little girl brought the truth," she said. "You brought temper." And that was it. The breakdown wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive. It was slow, visible, and inevitable, like watching a dam crack, inch by inch, until the flood finally rushed out. Crockett slammed her palm against the podium one last time, the sound sharp and hollow in the cavernous hall. "You're trash, Karoline. Arrogant trash," the room gasped. But Karoline didn't react. She didn't wince, she just looked at her, and whispered, just loud enough for the mic to catch it, "Now, everyone sees it." And they did. For a full 10 seconds no one said a word, not the moderator, not the cameras, not the crowd that had filled the American Civic Forum with heat and friction just minutes earlier. Jasmine Crockett stood frozen, chest heaving, eyes wide, still reeling from her own outburst. The word trash still hung in the air like smoke after a detonation, and on the other side of the stage, Karoline Leavitt didn't move. She didn't need to. Her restraint said it all. In that stillness, something shifted. Not in Karoline's delivery, but in the room itself. What had started as a battle of ideologies had quietly become something more familiar to the men watching, a test of discipline. And in that moment, every man who'd ever been baited in a boardroom, in a union hall, on the floor of a factory, or on the front lines, recognized exactly what Leavitt had just done. She had stood still while the storm tore itself apart. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward and spoke. Not loudly, but clearly enough for every man in the room to hear. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, "you've shouted 5 times, slammed the podium twice, and called me a puppet, a fraud, and now trash. I haven't raised my voice once, but I've answered every question, with numbers, with policy, with proof." She let that settle before continuing. "I'm not here to win applause. I'm here to win back the truth. If that bothers you, maybe it's not me you're upset with." That did it. From the back row, a man in his 60s, broad-shouldered, hands rough from years of factory work, stood up. No words, just a slow, deliberate nod. Then another man followed, then another. A wave of silent respect spread across the hall, not for drama, but for discipline. Jasmine tried to interrupt, but the moderator raised a hand for silence. The crowd had made its choice. And for the first time all night, Karoline Leavitt looked straight into the camera, her voice cool as winter's steel. "America deserves leaders who don't lose control when challenged, who don't trade facts for fury. Tonight, I stood here and told the truth, and the truth stood its ground." She stepped back. No chant, no fanfare, just thunderous applause, not for a performer but for a professional. It didn't end with a final word, it ended with a walk. Jasmine Crockett's face was flushed, her breath uneven, her hands still shaking from the fury she couldn't quite control. She tried to speak, but the words got tangled. Blunt, brittle, meaningless. Her gaze scanned the room as if searching for someone, anyone, to rally behind her. But the energy had changed. The cheers were gone. The righteous fire that had once carried her had burned too hot too fast. And now, there was nothing left but smoke. She slammed her notes down. "This is a farce," she muttered, her voice cracking. "I'm not here to be humiliated." Then she turned and walked off stage. Not with purpose, not with dignity, with damage. The sound of her heels echoed down the wooden floor like retreating footsteps on a battlefield. One camera followed her just long enough to catch the tears she wiped away before disappearing behind the curtain. The back door thudded shut, loud and final. On stage, Karoline Leavitt stood still, eyes tracking Crockett's exit like a general watching the last flames of resistance flicker out. She didn't speak. She didn't smirk. She just stood, composed, steady, and unshaken. Then the audience rose, not all at once, but deliberately. Men who'd served, built, bled, and buried too many friends to be fooled by noise. They stood not to celebrate a victory, but to acknowledge a truth. The one who kept her footing deserved their respect. A standing ovation. Not for flash, for fortitude. The moderator approached the mic, visibly shaken. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed something extraordinary." Leavitt stepped forward one last time, her voice low but firm. "I didn't come here to win a fight. I came here to hold the line." And with that, she turned away from the podium, not in retreat, but in resolution. The story wouldn't end here, but the debate had, and everyone in that hall knew. One left in a fury, one stood in the fire, and only one earned the room. By morning, the clip had gone global. The moment Jasmine Crockett stormed off stage, her voice breaking, her fury uncontained, was replayed across every network, looped, dissected, memed. But what cut deeper than the theatrics was the contrast. Karoline Leavitt, unshaken, unmoved, standing tall while her opponent unraveled. Headlines didn't mince words. Composure defeats chaos. Leavitt holds the line. Even typically hostile anchors were forced to admit she hadn't just won a debate, she'd defined one. On talk radio, callers chimed in from across the country. Ohio, Wisconsin, Montana, Alabama. Men who'd worked double shifts, who'd watched the political class fumble for years, finally heard something different. Not just policy, poise, presence, power without volume. One retired steel worker from Scranton summed it up best. She didn't flinch. That's leadership. That's the America I remember. Social media lit up, but this time the noise worked in Karoline's favor. Clips of her line, "I've raised the standard," went viral, not because they were flashy, but because they felt earned. Fathers shared it with sons, veterans reposted it with simple captions like, "This is how you lead." Meanwhile, Crockett's office issued a short press release blaming selective editing and performative ambush tactics. But few were listening. The damage was done, and not by manipulation, but by her own reaction. In diners and hardware stores, in break rooms and barber shops, the conversation wasn't about sides anymore. It was about strength. Who kept their head? Who folded under fire? And in that measure, Karoline Leavitt didn't just survive the civic forum, she stamped her name into it. In the end, it wasn't the data that won the room. It wasn't the applause, the headlines, or even the viral clips. It was the moment Karoline Leavitt stood still. Not as a mouthpiece, not as a rising star, but as a leader who refused to be dragged into the chaos around her. For the men who watched, many with scars earned in silence, with decades of experience behind them, that moment said more than 1,000 speeches ever could. They'd seen the loud ones before, the performers, the posers, the ones who talk big and fold when the pressure hits. What they hadn't seen in a long time was someone who kept their bearing when things got ugly, who absorbed the insults, the shouting, the venom, and answered not with rage, but with discipline and evidence. Karoline Leavitt didn't just outlast Jasmine Crockett, she outclassed her, in front of the nation, in a room that had no tolerance left for excuses or theatrics. And the lesson? It's one many in that audience already knew deep down, that in a time where everyone wants to go viral, real leadership still whispers. It stays steady, it refuses to break, because the truth doesn't panic. It doesn't scream, it just waits for the noise to die down. Then it speaks. And when it does, men who know what it means to hold the line recognize it instantly. So as the headlines fade and the next flashpoint grabs the world's attention, those men will remember something that can't be scrolled past or shouted over. The woman who stood calm while another unraveled, not because she wanted to win a moment, but because she was built for the long haul. The real takeaway from the Civic Forum wasn't about party lines or political allegiance. It was about what leadership looks like when the spotlight turns brutal. In a world obsessed with noise, drama, and viral moments, Karoline Leavitt showed that true power doesn't yell, it endures. She faced personal attacks, emotional outbursts, and a desperate opponent unraveling in real time, yet never raised her voice. Why? Because when you're grounded in facts, you don't need volume, you need poise. Jasmine Crockett didn't lose because of a quote. She lost because of her reaction to truth. And that's the lesson. When you sacrifice composure, you surrender credibility. In the end, Leavitt didn't win by force, she won by refusing to flinch. And in doing so, she reminded a weary nation that grit, grace, and discipline still matter, especially when the cameras are rolling.